Chapter 1, 1st of January 2006, the Billybanks, Penarth. I was lying in the grass in the cold, wet mud. My bare, stinging chest was being soothed by the piercing breeze after the chops I'd just received. Steve was carefully placing the NAW Heavyweight Championship belt back into its case, blood seeping from his nose. I eventually got up. Only a few people were there, joking around, barely paying attention to my motionless state. I realized I couldn't lie there forever, dwelling on the fact that my big match with backyard wrestling legend Steve Farrell could have gone a lot better. So I got to my feet, my torn black t-shirt draped around me in tatters, and the disappointment in how the match went soon became irrelevant, as I realized, regardless of how this particular outing had gone, that it might be worth giving this wrestling thing a proper shot. 10 years earlier. You know those memories you have where something important happened in your life but you only recall the moment of emotion, not the whole picture? I was waiting for everyone to filter out of my dad's dojo in Penarth, my hometown, after a ninjutsu lesson. He taught a bunch of kids of varying ages, including myself, in a small upstairs floor of an old church. I was hanging back outside of a tiny room that I suppose you would call an office. It had a desk, so I'm calling it an office. I was very nervous because I was about to go and tell my dad that I was moving away. I can remember the look on his face and my gut feeling of apprehension and sadness. I have no idea what I said, what he said, or anything before or after that moment. It's funny how our minds collect these fragmented memories, and I sometimes wonder how accurate they even are too. I have such a strong and vivid recollection of punching a classmate in the side of the head after school one day. He'd been bugging me all afternoon, bullying me in a kind of passive-aggressive way, and I just snapped. Thrown completely off guard, he looked at me in shock and pain as I firmly said, "That's a warning." I'm pretty sure it never happened though. There was no repercussion to that incident, from him, the school, or anyone who saw it happen. It therefore can only have been my utmost desire to do just that, clock him in the head and give him my best tough guy one-liner that has somehow merged into my memory. Is my brain trying to convince me that it happened, and I've caught it in the act? And that, dear reader, or in this case listener, is exactly the kind of keenly observed psychological musing you can probably not expect from the rest of this book. I mean, I know my dad didn't react in the really bad way I must have been anticipating in that office all those years ago. I have a fractured feeling deep inside my brain that tells me he was very comforting and reassuring to me about it. My mum had remarried and my new stepdad, who I loved at the time, was in the army, so we were to move with him to Lark Hill, a military garrison town in Wiltshire, England. It was a surreal experience at 8 years old to up and move to a whole new house, let alone a new country, when all I'd ever known and been cognizant of was one home. I'd lived in a few places as a baby, but all I knew was the comforting familiarity of Chichester Road in the infamous area known as the Billybanks in Penarth, South Wales. A location that'll become a character of its own in this story. Growing up in that house with my mum, I had a string of obsessions, from Thomas the Tank Engine to Sonic the Hedgehog and the seminal moment of falling in love with Star Wars. Yet in that house, my very first home, I never saw a single second of what would become the biggest obsession of the next 15 years of my life, wrestling. I was barely aware of it. When we relocated our lives from the sunny shores of South Wales to the endless fields of Salisbury Plain, I discovered professional wrestling. It would go on to have a huge impact on my teenage life and mold me into the person I am today. Lark Hill was also new and exciting. There was a small wood just outside my house that I was able to play in until it was dark, and I could always see the light of our kitchen window and feel safe. I quickly found a best friend in Chris Marshall as I walked around my class on my first day of school, asking everyone where they lived, which was an uncharacteristically outgoing move for me at the time. Chris replied to my question with the same street that I lived on, and this seemed to be a perfect reason to become the bestest of buds. Living in the country was so different to the more urban landscape of Penarth, and I had some of the best times of my childhood there, just playing outside all day without a care in the world. One summer, the wood next to where I lived became a dumping ground for logs for some reason, and so we all started taking them from their piles to build forts amongst the trees. Some of the local kids were really great at putting them together, almost directing the construction like foremen at times. It was like some weird kind of Lord of the Flies community between 3 and 8 p.m. every day after school. It was during one of those warm summer nights sitting inside one of the forts, an especially elaborately constructed den with an entrance on the roof, that some of the kids started talking animatedly about wrestling. I didn't know them very well though, so I didn't attempt to join in on the conversation, but I listened and made a mental note to check out what all the fuss was about. After perusing the channels on our cable box one morning, I found the World Wrestling Federation. This is where I can try and make out like it was a Jake Blues seeing the light kind of moment, but it wasn't quite that formative. It caught my attention, there was something captivating about it, but I wasn't hooked just yet. Over the next year or so, I would catch a Saturday morning airing of a show here and there, becoming more and more enamored with the larger-than-life characters. I will always point to Mick Foley as being my first real favourite wrestler, while Shawn Michaels eventually took the all-time top spot. However, the man who really reeled me into that crazy world of bright lights and hard-hitting action was Stone Cold Steve Austin. Arguably the most popular and successful professional wrestler of all time, the Texas Rattlesnake had an infectious, take-no-names, kick-ass attitude that informed a generation. Whether he was spewing mild obscenities to his opponents, downing beers after a victory, or dropping his boss, the one and only Vince McMahon, with a stone-cold stunner, he was endlessly entertaining. He also provided me with the knowledge to realise my closer friends were also fans of wrestling. The most popular sport in the UK is, has, and probably will always be football. I was never taken with it growing up, but it was a necessity to play it out on the field between our streets, as most children's outdoor lives revolved around footy. One cold December day, I was playing football with the Guy brothers, Ben and Jamie, the Smiles brothers, Martin and Jono, along with Dean Jones and my best mate Chris Marshall. Using jackets as goalposts, one particular score had seen the ball cross dubiously across one of the markers, and neither team could decide whether it counted or not. Being boisterous young boys who hadn't even reached double digits yet, cooler heads did not prevail. Ben grabbed Martin and I panicked before quickly realising it was only playful. Then suddenly Dean had gotten involved and hooked Ben's head over his right shoulder with his arm and jumped to the ground. "Stunner! Stunner!" someone shouted in reference to Steve Austin's finishing move. I laughed and felt a surge of excitement and amusement. The idea that my circle of friends might watch the bizarre yet alluring blend of sports and entertainment had never really occurred to me before that day. I quickly began asking them everything and anything about their interest in wrestling, how long they'd been watching it, who was their favourite, and did they have any tapes. Most of them had the same response. They had only been watching Monday Night Raw for a while, and everyone loved Stone Cold. It gave us more to bond over, and in the coming months we would play wrestle in the field, borrow VHS tapes off each other, and generally indulge in being wrestling fanatics. Even though it had become the start of a new obsession for me, I still didn't catch up with every WWF show, and didn't know a lot about the storylines on a regular basis. The internet was still in its infancy at this point, and I assumed that a wrestling magazine would only exist if I made one myself. Ben started to get the official home video releases of pay-per-view events, which were really exciting. It was one thing to have recordable tapes of Raw episodes, but to have a full pay-per-view and an official release with awesome artwork on the cover seemed like the best thing since the Super Nintendo at the time. Sometime in the summer of the following year, Dean suggested we all start having proper wrestling shows of our own. We already play wrestled around all the time, so why not have our own characters and shows? So we decided to try and find a place to do it where we wouldn't be disturbed by our parents, and settled on a spot inside one of the many woods in Lark Hill near Ben and Jamie's house. We cleared a square patch of ground from leaves and stones and even swept up a rectangular spot outside of the ring to mark where the imaginary commentator's table would be. I think Dean even set up some flimsy string across 4 poles to simulate turnbuckles and ropes. I really wish I had brought my camera along to some of those little events we did. Having those memories on video would be amazing. It was all very exciting to a 9-year-old, and we all thought our first show was brilliant, of course. We weren't concerned with being good or even correct and safe. It was all about the fun factor. There wasn't much danger though, as we didn't even really slam each other. It was all holds and pissing about. One time though, I wrestled with some younger boys outside of my house and did a tombstone pile driver on one of them, a very dangerous move. My mum had seen me do it and told me to be more careful, especially with smaller boys. The way she had calmly told me to be more responsible resonated so much more than if she had shouted at me, one of the many reasons I wouldn't have wanted to be brought up by anyone else. Not that she didn't shout at me too, because she did. A lot. Over the next couple of years, wrestling took something of a back seat to other things. That Christmas, a little game called The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time found its way under some of our trees, not mine, and we would spend days exploring the world of Hyrule, spending far too much time on the fishing minigame in particular. And along with other instant classics such as Super Mario 64, playing on our Nintendo 64 consoles became the #1 pastime in the neighborhood. It wasn't until the following year when we all caught the WWF bug again, around the time of WrestleMania 2000. By this point in time, I had entered the big bad world of high school, which had always been hyped up as a terrifying experience, but of course, This was simply just another step up the educational ladder. The sad thing was a few of my Larkhill friends didn't go to the same comprehensive school as me. We still played together in the afternoons and evenings though, and would excitedly discuss the latest goings on in the World Wrestling Federation. Stone Cold had left to have neck surgery in late 1999, leaving the inimitable superstar known as The Rock to become the new phenomenon. Every week he'd say something so funny that by the time we met up, we had all memorized his freshest saying. From shut your mouth and know your role to take your insert any object here for added comedic effect, turn it sideways and stick it straight up your candy ass, and beyond. We started to wrestle again, but entering our teenage years, it wasn't quite as carefree or innocent as it once was. The built-in alpha male instinct started to take over for some of the guys, and instead of doing what professional wrestlers do, cooperating with each other to work a wrestling match, they would make it real. Which for the purposes of this book is what is known as going shoot, by eliminating the element of theatricality that enables wrestling to be so exciting. At the time you could compare wrestling to boxing, and these days, mixed martial arts is an even bigger example. Sure, there is an edge and thrill to seeing real competition that you don't get with pro wrestling, yet an MMA fight can last 10 seconds and end with a knockout. A wrestling match always strives to put on a show for the audience, a back and forth encounter with twists and turns designed to entertain. Real fighting is competitive sport. Pro wrestling is a competitive art form. Bringing a shoot aspect into our matches took the play right out of play wrestling and turned it into something I was growing uncomfortable with. It all came to a head one summer evening as we wrestled on a spot of grass behind Chris Marshall's house. He was wrestling Martin, who had put him in a figure 4 leg lock, a fairly complicated maneuver where you twist your opponent's leg over his other. When it's hooked in correctly, it looks very painful, and the person held in it can scream in pain, making it appear agonizing. On the other side of the coin, if you apply extra pressure, it can actually be as agonizing as it looks, which Martin decided to do, to show off his dominance. It seemed to some of the guys that the more real, the better. But even then, I knew that that wasn't what wrestling was all about. I could tell Chris was really struggling with the pain, and Martin didn't let him go until he saw silent, angry tears rolling down Chris's face. I had only seen my best friend cry twice, including that moment. He was younger than me, but I always looked up to him as a towering example of toughness. Me, I cried every week, forget about it. Besides being a wimp, I also struggled with confrontational situations. Even something as minor as being singled out by a teacher in class, my eyes would always well up out of frustration. Chris, though, he never cried, and when he begrudgingly let a few tears drop that night, he wasn't met with compassion or remorse, but with laughter at his expense. Everyone seemed to find it really funny except for me, and of course Chris himself. He stood up and shook it off, immediately feigning that he wasn't bothered or hurt by it at all. It really upset me, and I had no backbone to do or say anything about it. I thought that would be the end of it, but I saw something brewing behind his eyes, and he suddenly went for Martin. The fight lasted a few seconds as everyone jumped in to stop it, so Chris just gave up and went home. To see him so angry and embarrassed was horrible. We were all growing up and growing apart, and this incident just served to speed up that process. That uneasy moment marked the end of our closeness. We all continued to hang out with less and less frequency, but things were never really the same. It was a shame it went down like that, but within a year we'd all moved away from Larkhill. The earlier years with those guys are some of my most cherished childhood memories, but they're always ever so slightly tainted by that ugly summer night. To paraphrase Stone Cold Steve Austin himself, boys will be boys, and boys are dumb. 16th of December 2006, Houghton Regis Leisure Centre, Dunstable. I was lying face down on the sweaty judo mats, the veins in my forehead throbbing. I was selling the fact that I was knocked out, and after 18 minutes of exertion, it wasn't particularly hard to pretend. I had just taken 6 curb stomps in a row, and the last one really knocked me loopy after Alex had firmly planted his heel behind my brain case and executed the final move of the match, sending my face crumpling into the unforgiving mat. I wearily thought, I need a bath. As I lifted myself to my knees, blood still faintly trickling out of a small cut near my hairline. Nicky rushed forward and said, "Look up and say cheese, Luke," and took a few pictures of my head with his phone before giving me a hug and telling me he loved the match. Alex came over and we hugged too, really happy with what we'd done, but exhausted.